Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Dirk Forrester. I'm the President and CEO of the International Emissions Trading Association. Thanks for coming in today. I know some people are just getting out of lunch, so we'll probably have a few folks joining us in progress, but I do want to respect your time and go ahead and kick off here. For 18 years, IETA and PwC have collaborated on a greenhouse gas market sentiment survey. And this event is really to present the results, give you a little sense of what the pulse check is on carbon markets around the world. This one we always have felt pairs nicely with the State and Trends market report that the World Bank issued yesterday, just because you kind of get this sense of what's going on around the world, and then you also get a feel for how market participants are reacting to it. Obviously, we're appearing in a time of added uncertainties in the world related to wars and to tumult in energy markets and economic challenges around. But it's really interesting that carbon markets have kind of weathered those storms and continue to press ahead. But there's also a year of global stock take on the climate change side, where we'll be gathering with world leaders in Dubai toward the end of this year for a COP where they're going to take stock of what's actually happening environmentally, how well are national programs stacking up in terms of delivering on commitments that they've made, and do the commitments themselves add up to enough? So I think getting a sense of how markets help to deliver on national ambitions and corporate ambitions is part of what we try to tease out in this report. So it does all tie to that broader set of activities related to delivering the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. These markets that you'll hear about and carbon pricing systems, they don't exist in a vacuum. They don't exist just to raise money. They exist to deliver environmental benefit. And I think you'll get a sense of how there's continuing strength in how people are looking at carbon markets. So with that, I'm going to stop and introduce Ian Milborough from PwC, who is going to give us the highlights of the report, which will be posted, or I guess is posted online probably as we speak. But Ian, the floor is yours.
Many thanks. Thanks, Dirk. Okay, so good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm conscious that we're competing with the after effects of a very generous lunch, but the lights are suitably dim, so in the event you need to take an appropriate snooze, that's entirely in order. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ian Milborough, partner at PwC, and delighted to be here at I4C to present the results of this year's GHG Market Sentiment Survey. As Dirk said, we've been doing this for 18 years. And over that time, I guess I'd call out two headlines. First, the percentage of the world that's now covered by a carbon price, and that number is rising year on year. And secondly, the corresponding expansion of IETA membership, which is always a good thing to hear. And in my view, surveys like this are important because they reflect sentiment from folks like you see on the panel today that are in the markets every day, and they reflect and the membership of IETA's views, both compliance players, intermediaries, and investors. So I'm going to quickly canter through the main findings of the report, and then we'll join colleagues in a discussion about the implications of the findings. So it's been quite a year in global carbon markets, both on the compliance side and in the voluntary side. And I think we distill the sentiment we gathered from this year's survey into three main points. First of all, we see continued expectation around rising carbon prices in the future, perhaps not at quite the same rate as we saw last year. Many would argue that's a good thing, and that in many jurisdictions, perhaps to date, we haven't seen carbon prices at a level that's needed to spur decarbonisation, but this year's report shows prices trending upwards. Second, with reference to Europe specifically, IETA members expect the European Commission to set an ambitious 2040 climate target. Nearly half of respondents in the survey expect the EC will propose a 75% or greater emissions reduction. And thirdly, in the US, whilst a lot of attention in recent months has been focused on the IRA, the investment tax credit scheme that passed last year. It's important not to forget that there are 13 state-level ETS schemes already implemented in the US, particularly in California as the largest market, and these are being reviewed this year, and our membership expects, particularly in California, that horizon for carbon pricing to extend out beyond 2030. Turning to Europe and the UK, just to give you a flavour of what's happening there. The overarching theme is really that level of interim ambition in Europe on that trajectory to net zero by 2050. So you recall back in 2021, the EC set out the change it would make to phase 4 of the system, running from 21 through to 2030, and some of those plans are still to be put into effect. And they'll have the impact of introducing additional scarcity into the system. And the interface between the EU and ETS and the CBAM, again, those detailed rules being developed over the summer with expectation that will commence in October this year in the transition phase. The chart on the right really showing that that ambition that's been set out from CBAM is likely to result in many of the EU's trading partners mirroring with similar schemes over perhaps the medium term, particularly in the US, Canada, China, and were called out in this regard. And finally, a quick word on the UK. As some of you will know who've been in this game as long as I have, the EU had a standalone ETS back in 2002, 2005, when I was a much younger man. And then, of course, we were in the EU ETS, and now we're back out again. And this year's survey suggests that the UK will eventually reintegrate with the ETS at some point, but our ETA members were equally split whether that would happen before or after 2030. So that gives you a feel for Europe and UK. Now we turn to some of the other key markets. In Asia Pacific, the key stat I'd like to call out is with regard to the integration of the province-level schemes into a national Chinese ETS. And the figure there of 50% shows a bit of a marked decline to previous years. And I'm interested in the panel's and audience views about the reasons behind that. It looks like that integration is going to take a little longer than we thought. Also, a quick comment on Japan. Many of you will be aware that the Japanese cabinet approved the basic plan for GX, the Green Transformation Policy, a few months ago. And a key element of that is the so-called GX League that you see cited on the slide. It currently operates as a voluntary baseline and credit scheme, but our members expect it to evolve into a compliance grade scheme by 2026. So things happening in that part of the world as well. Then turning to the Americas, I mentioned already the survey considers both state-level action and federal action. In the states, California, which I know has been debated in recent weeks, whether it's the world's 5th or 4th largest economy. I don't know whether we want to get into that on the panel, depending on who you believe. But they're currently bringing forward proposals to extend the policy horizon of that scheme. And that's probably important because California is often seen as a bellwether in terms of climate action in the US. Similarly, in the Northeast states, the RGGI states, RGGI states, they are undergoing a program review this year that will think about design elements of that scheme and the impact created. And then a quick comment on the federal level, picking up figure 13 on the right there. Clearly, that's a big news story just by virtue of the enormous amount of tax dollars that are mobilized. What we're seeing here is that probably those policies, both state and federal, will operate in tandem, but we probably, given IRA and its rollout, we probably don't expect to see additional federal carbon pricing in the US anytime soon. Then turning, I think, a couple of interesting slides on emerging markets I'd like to bring to your attention. Here you see that respondents expect Brazil, Chile, and Colombia to be the most likely countries in the LATAM region to introduce ETSs in the near to midterm, say 2026. And from my point of view, that's encouraging, as we need those middle-income countries to come on board, and their desire to use market-based instruments, I think, is very encouraging to support achievement of their NDCs. No doubt technical assistance may be required to stand up those systems. I just got back from a climate finance accelerator in Vietnam that the UK government funds last week, and I was really excited by some of the pace of change there. Similarly, turning to Africa, Some of you will be aware of the ACMI, the African Carbon Markets Initiatives, launched at COP27 last year. To recall, this is an initiative intending to generate and retire around 300 million high-quality carbon credits annually by 2030. It's got a high level of ambition with a desire to unlock around $6 billion worth of investment and create nearly 30 million jobs by 2030. And I expect we'll hear more detail about that on the path up to COP28 later this year. As you can see, IETA members were pretty positive about this, with that 79% stat, and bringing Africa and that continent under the auspices of VCM more formally, I think talks to the scale we need to bring in the voluntary carbon markets. So we've talked about primarily compliance markets, but this survey does also touch on voluntary markets as well, and Article 6, so I'm going to give a couple of reflections there. I'm sure that the general prospects for VCM will have been debated extensively over Pinchos here in Bilbao during this event, but a quick comment to say that IETA membership expressed a clear view that the supply side could meet that demand for carbon credits that was going to be needed over the medium term. And as the chart on the right shows, that demand for carbon credits is underpinned by multiple factors, both the need to use those offsets, high-quality offsets, to deal with those residual emissions as part of net zero strategies, and perhaps some of the pre-compliance buying ahead of regimes like CORSIA that will evolve over the next few years. Final comment quickly that you see there with regard to the ICVCM, the Integrity Council on Voluntary Carbon Markets, and we at PwC work closely with them. That standardization, that desire to move to quality is something that was emphasized as being extremely important by membership, such that we deploy the right capital in support of the right activities. And then a quick word on Article 6.4. I know there might be some deep Article 6 folks in the room, so I'll be very careful what I say here so they don't throw things at me. Generally, I think there was a feeling felt that COP27 didn't make as much progress as we would have liked with regard to Article 6. Much more to be done on the build-up to COP28. We do see a bit of concern around the speed of within which Article 6 will become operational. As you can see there, about 74% don't think it will be operational until between 2026 and 2028. Now, that may be too bearish, and again, I await views from the panel on whether we think that's fair. So that's Article 6. And finally, we've been doing our price expectations chart since this survey began, with different color schemes as befits the fashion of the day. But what you're seeing here is a summary chart, both the dark line there over the near term, 2022, 2025, and the light blue, 2026 through 30, for the different jurisdictions, the primary jurisdictions we see that have carbon markets around the world. Most of this, I think, tallies with a lot of the analyst forecasts I've seen to suggest that, say, European carbon could be in the range of 90 to 140 euros per tonne by 2030. But perhaps interestingly, all the work I do with clients suggests that many of them are taking 100 euros, $100 a tonne by 2030 as a central estimate in their modelling for projects. And that's a marked increase in previous years. Many years ago, probably 50 was the central, and now we're probably getting to 100 in 2030. So I will pause there. And perhaps with that chart on the slide, invite Dirk and the panel to reflect about whether those kinds of prices are sufficient to drive that decarbonisation that we need to get us on that net zero path. So for now, I'll pause and thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ian. Really interesting set of findings, and I'm privileged to be joined by two of IETA's stars, right? Our board chair, Lisa DeMarco, who is the founder and lead partner at Resilient in Canada, and Belinda Ellington from Citibank, who is also, I think, has global responsibilities in the field of commodities, and particularly carbon commodities. So I want to start out with kind of a general question, and Lisa, I'll go to you first. Any standout messages here that either surprised you or resonated greatly with you?
I think there are three. And the first one is the state of the market last year, despite the state of energy markets. And generally, we anticipate a corollary growth trend or decline trend between carbon pricing and energy pricing. And despite challenges around affordability and associated context of the natural gas supply chain resulting from the war in Europe, there's still an extremely positive outlook around carbon pricing. So that in and of itself is an interesting signal for the marketplace that likes certainty. The second is in relation to the issues around the associated corresponding adjustments. And there was confidence that countries were going to increasingly implement emissions trading system or carbon pricing systems, that there would be appropriate accounting in line with the Paris Agreement, so those corresponding adjustments, but there wasn't an element of pricing certainty as to how much that premium would be. What we would actually see as a premium value for appropriately accounted for emission reductions with corresponding adjustment. And we really do want to see that premium value to draw in the money to the jurisdictions that need it most to facilitate the carbon financing. And the third element was in relation to the Americas, and in particular, where we've got very strong confidence in the California market going beyond 2030. That's different than what we used to see. Mm-hmm. So all positive in general, some interesting nuances in the data.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks, Lisa. Belinda, I'm going to come to you with the same opportunity of what resonated or what felt wrong about the report. Any standout messages for you?
Yeah, well, I couldn't possibly say there was anything wrong with the report because it's a piece of research, isn't it? It's what people think, and it's a bit of futurology, as any piece of research is. A couple of things which I think of, I would remark on. The first is just, as you said, right, there's a huge growth in the utilization of carbon markets as a tool to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. And I think that people are moving towards that for two reasons. So again, this is like my own sentiment rather than fact, right? One is you've got to look at the purpose of it. You can reduce emissions, but also it's a source of income, right? For the governments that actually create these compliance schemes. And they can look towards the EU ETS as a benchmark on how to set it up. So there is something that people can follow. And by analogy, I think that's what potentially will happen with Article 6.4 and 6.2. There's going to be a few front runners who will start setting up these systems. People will then be able to see how that works, and then you'll get an increase. And I think that's what we're seeing with carbon markets. But don't forget, there are a number of different types of markets and structures as well. So we're just talking about markets in general, which is about how you price, right? So it's a methodology for creating a price for carbon. And as a lot of this was centered on the price, I think that's quite interesting. And to put that in the context of your question about why there isn't a national Chinese system. Well, China is massive, right? And economically, it's hugely divergent from one area to another. You can't compare Shanghai, for example, to a central region. Also, industry is very focused in different areas within places like China, like the US, which is why we've got local systems in the US. So one type of scheme might be very appropriate for one geographic region, but not appropriate for another. The important thing is making sure that it fulfills its purpose, and that is to encourage people to reduce, create an income that governments can then use to facilitate transition. And I think that's very encouraging that more of these jurisdictions are starting to use this mechanism to do so. But let's not forget, it is only one tool in the box. And then what you were talking about with the Article 6 and the implementation of the timing of that. We don't know. I think that some countries that are going to put in place Article 6.4 or even 6.2 mechanisms just have more capability for doing so because of their existing internal governmental infrastructure, and others are simply going to need an awful lot of help to do that. So will the whole thing be up and running by date certain? No. I think we're going to have to give a lot of help, more help to some jurisdictions than others, and there are some front runners there already. I understand that Vanuatu and Ghana have already got some up and running. I was in a talk just now where I understand that Senegal is hoping to be up and running by next year. And these will be examples, like the EU ETS is an example. These will be examples which will enable that to then grow. Is the price correct? It is almost, that's sort of self-answering question. That's the point of it being a market. The market creates the price, and therefore it is the correct price if that's the way the market operates. But it's making sure that the mechanisms in place to control those prices at the right level and prevent leakage are in place. And with the EU ETS, you've got the market stability reserve, and that didn't work for a while. They're now re-looked at it. They're trying to create a more robust scheme, and hopefully people will be able to follow that and ensure that the price, along with the liquidity of the unit, creates the right impact.
It was interesting to me that it was a very clear message out of this about the expectations of a further strengthening of the ETS, and I think that resonated to me about, well, this year, I think it happened quicker than some people expected, that there's an agreement to extend an ETS to a whole nother sector, but now thinking out to 2040 has people giving thought to, like, what does that last ton cost in whatever year it is. You know, we understand there could be a removals policy coming along, but that sort of felt right to you, that the strengthening in the EU will continue?
Well, as you pointed out, it's been a kind of there's been a tumultuous few years for a number of different reasons, and the massive hike in energy prices had the inadvertent consequence of actually encouraging people to switch quite, rather more quickly than they thought they were going to have to non-fossil fuel production. What is important is that there is a price, and with compliance mechanisms, there is a predictable price. You can create a futures and you can create a pricing mechanism. And this is the difficulty that we have with the voluntary market. There is no price peg, and it works in a totally different way, or should I say the project-based carbon unit. You really have to reverse engineer into the project and how much that costs. So it's not really a market-based mechanism, it's a project cost-based mechanism. Whereas with an allowance, you just have to release sufficient number in there and be able to tweak that in order to create a price that has the desired effect of reduction. People may be at one end of the survey hoping that the price will remain low, and at the other end hoping the price will go very high. It totally depends on which part of the market you are. Yeah.
So kind of following on from this in terms of the discussion about the project-based side of the market, and you're exactly right, it's sort of like this architecture that can serve multiple purposes, right? You can be a unit that's recognized in the compliance market or is available for use in voluntary markets. And we've seen some interesting things happening in that, where part of it related to aviation, but I think also part of it related to just developing countries thinking about their own ambitions and their own compliance needs and what do they want to kind of have available. And I found it really interesting that, Ian, you raised the point about African preparedness this time, right? So which does seem to be building up, which I think is a really good thing. And you mentioned, I think, 2 out of 3 countries are in Africa that are perhaps leading the way on preparedness. And I guess kind of wanted to, from both of you, get a reaction on if you were speaking to an official from an African nation, what would you be thinking about in terms of preparing for the carbon market as we see it coming in the next decade? What should they be doing? Should they wait on the 6.4 mechanism? Should they lean into some of the partnerships available through 6.2 and use of private or independent standards? Should they build up capacity for voluntary markets, or should they hang back and wait for the compliance markets to materialize in other places where their units might find purchase? Any thoughts about what they should be doing right now? Or Lisa, you want to start on that one?
Sure. Many African jurisdictions are developing advanced energy infrastructure as we speak. So my strong view is that to hang back and do nothing is the wrong decision. There are many options available that can be run in parallel. So looking at the 6.2 and the availability of bilateral arrangements between countries is very interesting. Developing the appropriate infrastructure for accounting for emission reductions, in particular those corresponding adjustments and how they get reported into the Paris mechanism through things like partnerships with the Climate Action Data Trust. Really important and really can accelerate the inflow of finance and funds into the country faster and at a greater scale. So more faster would be very important in that regard. So all of those things can happen in parallel, and it's certainly not an uncharted pathway to start with a voluntary market mechanism, particularly through things like the ACMI that you were speaking about, Ian, and having that roll into a compliance mechanism. So these are all things that can happen, and that should happen. Standing back, particularly where you're developing assets that are emission intense, is not the right thing to do.
And Belinda, do you have a thought on that?
Well, once again, we talk about Africa, but it's hugely divergent continent. In some of those countries within Africa, it might be appropriate to start implementing some form of compliance scheme in those countries where there is actual production and heavy emissions. In other countries, it's going to be appropriate to try and leverage the existing will to try and help the voluntary carbon market, or I would say the project-based carbon reduction or removal projects within their own jurisdictions. So to reach out with people who've already been, there are a lot of experts out there who have been doing this for some time. Let's not forget, the voluntary carbon market has kind of become a very hot subject over the last, well, like 3 years, I think. But it's been around for a very long time. Yeah? And there are some very established mechanisms and methodologies which can be leveraged now. And it can help those countries raise the funds to help facilitate the setting up, for example, of a 6.4 or a 6.2 mechanism. So it would depend on which country I was talking to, obviously, on what kind of advice I would give them. But as Lisa says very correctly, there's no time like the present to act. And if there was a country sitting there thinking, well, I don't know what I should do, there are people out there who they can reach out to help advise. And we've seen this, there's a lot of encouragement of intra-country facilitation. You've got these supranational bodies as well, like the UNFCCC, you've got UNIP. There are organizations out there that can help facilitate an appropriate kind of mechanism for the country. So, I mean, the partnership, we've got Switzerland and Ghana again as well. So Switzerland is in there helping different countries set up schemes whereby they can create equivalent of ITMOs. Yeah.
Ian?
I was going to say, just to come in on that quickly, I mean, I've looked at various investable opportunities in the region. I think a lot of them actually collapse to sort of standard project finance principles. I mean, can you get comfortable with country risk? Can you get comfortable with exchange rate risk? A lot of the governance structures that you will need, there will be people who will price and take that risk, but you need to be able to do it at a scale where it makes sense. And those, and particularly in adaptation, are big projects. A lot of the smaller mitigation projects, the transaction costs of doing them will eat up a lot of the value. So I think that points to me to a lot of much more close collaboration between sources of public and private capital and different layers of the landscape that can price and hedge those different tranches of risk appropriately.
Yeah.
And there's some
you can't hedge a price unless you've got a price, right? And that is the trouble with the voluntary market, is that there is no price to peg it against. Well, there are some, but only for certain methodologies.
Maybe we talk a second here on the voluntary market. I may want to come back to Africa and Middle East because I thought a couple of interesting things there. But on the voluntary market, the questions kind of centered around the integrity challenges and the potential role of the ICVCM and core carbon principles. And I think it's trying to get at this question about at least some part of the voluntary market that lends itself well to a commodity treatment, right, of a like for like for like. But I'm curious about, Lisa, about your reactions to the sort of sentiment about the potential success of that initiative, and looks like it would be welcomed by the market. But what's your reaction to that piece of it?
Yeah, I think the survey was pretty clear that there was some confidence that the ICVCM and related mechanisms, I would roll the VCMI on the demand side into that as well, will create confidence and help with certainty and long-term stability growth of the voluntary carbon market. That didn't surprise me. A little bit of price softening. Let me rephrase. A little bit of softening in the expectation of price growth this year compared to last year. And that is in part through, I think what we're seeing is misinformation in the marketplace. We're seeing some press come out that's not entirely based on the science that we're seeing in the marketplace. We're seeing consolidation of related good principles, good science to actually combat some of that misinformation. So I expect there to be more of that. And I actually do expect the forward expectation of price growth in the voluntary market to return to historical levels. So that was a little bit of a surprise for me, but not entirely shocking in light of the strange press we've seen over the last year.
Melinda, I'd love to get your thoughts on that too, but also specifically on a point that kind of came out, I think, Ian, in your write-up there about what's driving the interest in the voluntary market, and kind of a pretty clear message that this is the financial disclosure world and corporate efforts to get to net zero. Do you feel there's any likelihood of softening on the investor front on sort of net zero commitments? Or is this sort of a thing that's here to stay that's going to continue to provide that strong signal to companies that are enjoying the investment from large financial institutions?
Well, coming from a large financial institution, we're hoping very much that it will stay. And we are seeing a lot of investor interest. I'd like to kind of go to the commoditized side of it, because this kind of very much links into investment and whether we can create investment products and tools that are reliable. So, as I'm sure people in the audience know, the ICVCM is attempting to create a kind of common baseline standard or a benchmark against which you can measure the quality of a carbon unit, and thereby create sort of a commoditized unit. Now, to me, the purpose of a commoditized unit is that it may then enter into some form of compliance scheme. At the moment, people who are the end buyer of a carbon unit kind of want the story behind it, because that's why they're doing it. If they're doing it voluntarily without a compliance obligation, they don't want a commoditized unit. They want to be able to say, look at what we've done, right? We have helped this forestry project, or we've done a cook stove project in this country, or we've helped repurify water. So the commoditization of that isn't necessarily ripe right now. That will kind of start and grow. Why are people doing it? Well, it almost doesn't matter why, right? But the financial disclosures at the moment don't allow you to say that you are reducing your footprint by offsetting. Offsetting isn't actually an accounting concept. It is a concept that is used to try and encourage your stakeholders to come to you because you want to demonstrate that you care. Right? So that's what's actually creating the investor interest, and long may it continue. There are some investors who are investing because they believe the price will move, and that will be good for them financially. But that isn't the purpose of the carbon market, and I don't think that's the purpose of the investment going in. I think the purpose is the result of the project still.
And Lisa, does that resonate the same way in Canada? And then I'll come to you. Yeah.
It does in general. I think that a number of corporates are bullish on their related targets, and they're doing so not just because of an altruism. They're actually getting the investor inquiries and demands around, say, on climate. So if you go to an annual general meeting of the board, you will hear shareholder resolutions around, say, on climate, and also increasingly so, discretionary pay of the most senior executives being tied to not just having a target, but the outcomes and results of that target. And you're seeing coalescence of institutional investors vote on directors on that basis, demand associated outcomes and structures on that basis, and pressure the global disclosure organizations like the International Sustainability Standards Board, increasingly the US Securities Exchange Commission, in Canada, Canadian Securities Administrators, to provide guidance and certainty for the corporates who are trying to meet those targets in good faith and are scared to death about greenwashing complaints. So this is not going away.
Yeah.
This is not going away at all. There's one area I'm bullish on. It's enhanced climate action of corporates.
Ian.
I was going to say, I'd probably group the clients I work with into three buckets in terms of what their stance is on offsets right now. The first is, it's all too complicated. The press, some of the recent press suggests there's a high level of risk here. I'm going to do nothing and sit on my hands for a while the market washes itself out, goes through a next cycle. We move to slightly more standardized approaches. Perhaps we move more from OTC to exchange-driven markets. There's greater price discovery. So that they're in one camp. The second camp are they want to dabble in the water like an Englishman when he goes onto the beach in France with his trousers rolled up just over his knees. And they want kind of optionality on things, but they don't want to commit too strongly. They want to buy options to access volume at some point, but don't want to really deploy serious cash. And then the third group are those who have a materially large position. They know that position isn't going away, but they know they don't have the skills in-house to deal with it. So they are looking for vehicles and ventures to deploy proper dollars, to deploy serious capital in structures where they can share the risk with other participants and people who are better placed to originate high quality volumes for them, and who remain cognizant of all these developments in the market, so they can, if you like, be taking a basket view of access to what they buy.
Great. That's pretty interesting. I think that feels about right to me, but I do think there's also a feeling that there may be more, as this spotlight intensifies, Lisa, more moving into that third bucket perhaps, but let's see. I'm going to ask one more question of this illustrious group, and then I'm going to invite audience participation if any of you have a question. So think about that, and I think we've got somebody to pass a mic around. So but I would love to reserve 5 or 10 minutes for questions from the audience. One of the other things that I kind of wondered about, maybe on the motivation front, and about the shift in preparedness for Paris goals, and it actually relates to the CBAM. And this might be the first year that we have surveyed anything on carbon border adjustments. It's already providing interesting reactions. I think we're seeing interest rise in certain jurisdictions of maybe this is time to accelerate work on our own pricing program. I think there are corporates also thinking about how they plan for that, and a lot of interest in our membership about how the actual implementation of it, I guess at a product level, will work. So, but this thing's upon us, right? It's passed. It's We're going to be reporting for the first time this year, I think, in at least imports in the EU. I'm kind of just curious about your thoughts about the movement. I got to ask the tax guy too, because obviously it's a tax-oriented thing. But Ian, I'll let you go last. I'll go to you, Lisa. Thoughts on the border adjustment topic, because it's not just a European thing right now. It's happening other places.
And will continue to happen other places. No doubt in my mind that major emissions intense commodities are caught in an ethos of enhanced trade protectionism. It kind of feels like that 1938, 1939 Smoot-Hawley world where we've got, particularly following the pandemic, a retrenchment of a sentiment of local production and local supply from a labor perspective, from an access and supply chain perspective, and from a certainty perspective. And if you put that context on a carbon market lens, or you put a carbon market lens in that context, border carbon adjustments make perfect sense. And there's no way the EU that now has a passed and implemented, well, soon to be implemented end of the year, border carbon adjustment will do that alone without its trade partner friends. So they call this friend shoring in the trade context. We're going to see carbon friend shoring increase quite rapidly by the end of the year. So Canada's already announced. The US, I believe it's Sheldon Whitehouse, do I have that right, has a draft bill coming forward in relation to border carbon adjustments. More to come. And more to come, particularly when the sting of implementation starts to bite exporters putting products into those jurisdictions.
Do you have views on this one, Belinda?
Oh, yes.
I figured.
So what is it for, right? The carbon border adjustment. So just to refresh ourselves, the idea is to stop carbon leakage because, as Lisa says, we don't have local production. If you are, whatever, a sports clothing manufacturing company retailing across the EU, to be honest, it's unlikely that you are actually manufacturing those clothes within the EU, right? So you're probably manufacturing them somewhere where it's an awful lot cheaper, and there isn't an EU ETS that increases the price and the fuel is cheaper and labour, etc. So the idea is that if you're not paying for that at the place of manufacture, then you're going to have to pay for it as it comes in. This could be problematic, though. It is a mechanism that has a theory, but we haven't seen how it works. And we haven't seen whether it will actually have the desired effect. Because let's say you're not that EU-based manufacturing company, but you are, in fact, a manufacturing company whose whole operation is not within the EU, and you are manufacturing. You're simply just going to direct a certain product that has been taxed towards the EU, and then the rest of it will just go somewhere else. It might go somewhere else and then come in somehow. So controlling that could be quite hard. And we also want to, I suppose, make sure that the EU isn't carrying the entire load, right? For the achievement of the carbon reduction. But I think the net result will actually be a decline in consumption. For me, that's not a bad thing, right? I think that we've got addicted to consumption as a means of creating income. It's the buzzword every time we have a look at the budget. And it may have the effect of shifting manufacturing to a more local region and thereby reducing emissions just like that, through that method. So we don't know actually how it will work or whether it will work, but like the early days of the EU ETS, it's got to get out there and then it will be adjusted and tweaked to try and make sure that it has its desired effect.
If I can just pop in briefly, the one thing that we didn't mention was just how important data is going to become. So even if other countries don't implement a border carbon adjustment, environmental product labeling, critical.
Another big one lurking out there. Ian, thoughts on the CBAM? as our
Yeah, I mean,
respondents are coming to grips with it.
I think three things kind of concern stroke worry me about it. The first, I think Linda alluded to, I think there's actually quite some opportunities for gaming here, which I think that would be quite interesting in terms of how products get to where they're going around the world.
Yeah.
The second, and related to that, I think how the Commission decides to determine equivalence in terms of third-party jurisdictions. I think that's going to be quite a spicy topic. The second one, and you've mentioned it just there, data requirements. When I talk to the customs and tax guys in PwC, the amount of information required to actually, even in the reporting period, is probably likely to be quite substantial.
Yeah.
And I think the final point is, and it sort of relates to the debate you've seen over the IRA restrictions, and then is Europe too slow in reciprocating? Now, I think we are now in a realm of climate policy and intersection of trade policy much more broadly and for the longer term, which I think is interesting, but could have myriad effects of how it plays out. But again, you mentioned, Dirk, think back to pre-ETS 2005. How long was the introductory period we had in the reporting period before we started ETS? We're starting October 1st this year with full commencement Jan 1, 26. So you've got 2 years, 3 months. Now, you should be able to get your head around it, regardless of what rules are finalised over the summer. I would hope so, but I think the data and how the data flows will be critical.
Yeah. So more coming on that topic, I think, from the European Commission later this month, maybe. So we've got a few minutes left. Is anyone in the audience with a question? Please, yes. And so we have one right down here, and it looks like there's a microphone on its way. I can't really see what's in his hand. It might be a beer. No, it's a microphone. Okay.
Thanks, guys. This is my favorite session so far for the 2 days, so it's really good.
Thank you.
A question on the price chart. My name's Hugh Slater, by the way, at Client Earth in Beijing. We've been doing a survey just on China for about the last 10 years. Your price for China, if I was doing the conversion right, was about 200 RMB by 2025 and 300 by 2030. Quite a bit higher than the ones that we're managing to get, which is good, optimistic. I'm just wondering whether you elucidate anything out of the rationale for the responses that you're getting. Is it policy that they're foreseeing coming down the line, or is it just general, I don't know, just general sentiments? Do you get sort of comments that explain people's predictions there? That'd be great. Thanks.
Any wisdom on that one, Ian?
Gosh. I mean, you're probably sitting in Beijing. You're probably better placed than I to comment on that. But I think there's both. Historically, prices have traded in sub $10 typically. So that, and at the moment it's limited to certain sectors, isn't it? Now I think there has been some text produced setting out expansion and coverage to additional sectors over the near future or the midterm. So that will extend the base size of the market. With a greater base, one would hope there's more liquidity, more activity. I think it's still unclear whether there will be more intermediary involvement in the market, in addition to both the compliance players. As we've seen from the examples of other markets, if there are intermediaries allowed to participate, that should foster a greater multiple of trade of base. So you'd have to grab me for a coffee, and I would look at some of the more qualitative comments on China. I'd be very happy to, but just by virtue of the size of the country, it's important how it evolves, and I think we'll keep our eyes on it very closely.
If I can chime in just very briefly on that one, I will leave the intrinsic factors entirely to Ian and the folks that responded, but I think it's a mix of intrinsic and exogenous factors. And with the exogenous factors, the border carbon adjustment is not an irrelevant factor to consider on the pricing pressure.
Good. Thanks, and thanks for the question, Hugh. Other questions from the floor? An opportunity to have a microphone at I4C and you're not jumping at it. It's okay. Well, I think then what I want to do is kind of wind up this conversation with a set of closing comments from each of our speakers here. Ian ended with a picture of kind of like what carbon pricing looks like today, and In the year of global stock take, I just want your quick take on, do you think it looks like the market is aligning to a net zero world at Paris levels of ambition, or do we have a ways to go? I'll start with Belinda.
We have a way to go, I think. But if I'm going to be optimistic, which I'm going to be, because why not, right? We're here. We want to be optimistic. We want to foresee here that we will achieve those goals. The market mechanisms, as I said, and the 6.2, 6.4, all the other mechanisms, in fact, under the Paris Agreement, because there are a number of them, I hopefully will see, there's a slow growth and then there'll be an exponential growth, because as people start to understand how this operates, they will be able to copy, and then that will increase. If it carries on at this pace, we might have a problem.
Thank you. Lisa.
Yeah, I think if you think back to 30 years ago when we both kind of harvested into this nascent carbon market, it was always quite separate from financial factors. And the fact that we're seeing integration of carbon market pricing and associated systems into hardcore financial disciplines, the accounting, the reporting, the CFOs seized to this, is a good trend. So that is aligned with the Paris goals. In terms of timing, more, faster. We need much more, much faster. We're not going to hit that timeline right now.
Yeah. Ian.
I mean, if you looked at the most recent IR6 report, I mean, we're not getting close to those declining curves time soon. I am an optimist, believe it or not, and I'm founded on optimism primarily actually through all the work I do around TCFD analysis with clients and looking at transition risk in the future in different jurisdictions where clients have assets, and they're taking views on capital projects that have a 25, 30 plus year life. And increasingly, as I alluded to quickly in my remarks, years ago they would have not had any carbon price in that capex evaluation. 5 years ago, it might have been $30 or $50 a ton. Increasingly now, if you're looking at something that's 20, 30 and beyond, often my counsel to them is think about maybe 100 as a central estimate and do sensitivity around it. Now, and many are doing that, and many are taking higher numbers. But I think that has a way to work through in the system in terms of allocating capital to the projects that will get us on those decarb journeys. What we've seen in some of the jurisdictions, prices have kicked up year on year. I mean, we got close to 100, or we nudged 100 in Europe, didn't we? That midterm forecast is looking sort of in that range. So at those levels, we're getting on the right track. The key for me, I think, is some of the middle income countries and some of the fast growth regions coming on stream, either with carbon pricing, as we've talked about today, or other mechanisms that allocate capital in the right way.
Great. Thank you, Ian. We are at the end of our time, so I will offer no final comment of my own except to thank Ian and the PwC team for producing this really terrific report. Look forward to doing it again next year. Lisa DeMarco, Belinda Ellington, thanks for your commentary on it, and join me in thanking the panel.
Thank you. Thank you.